Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session of Security and Sandwiches, hosted by Stone Security. The sandwiches part of the name is for those attending in person at a Stone office are treated to a lunch during the session. My name is Adam, and I am the Global Technology Center Manager for Stone Security here in Las Vegas. As we go through today's topics, please drop any questions or comments in the chat, and we will respond to them as we are able to. Today, we are primarily going to be focusing our efforts on features found in the management client. The version that I'm running today and that I will be showing you all these things from is 2024 R1, which is the current release, though we do expect 2024 R2 here in the coming weeks. So even if you do not currently have access to the management client in your current role, this is still valuable information for you to learn, as it may be important both for a future role or even just to gain a better understanding of how Milestone works more on the back end. All right, the first thing we want to cover is where do you get the client download from? The management client is an application just like the smart client that can be installed on any Windows-based machine, and it can be downloaded directly from your management server. So if you haven't done that before, the example I'm showing here is my management server. Yours will be different, but it's going to be https:// and then you're going to put in the host name or the fully qualified domain name of your management server. This is the same address that is used to log into Milestone. So I'll show you that here. If you open up your smart client, if you're ever unsure of what that address is, if you're able to log into the smart client, then you're able to also get access to this downloads page. All right, there we go. So here in the top box labeled computer, this is the name of the server that we are connecting to. The host name for me is GTC-Milestone, and then we have the domain portion on the end of that. All right, so you're going to just drop that in there, and then at the end of that, you're going to add in another /installation. And you can leave the default, -en-us part off. You don't need to worry about trying to remember that. You can just do https:// host name or fully qualified domain name or IP address. You can put that in there as well, /installation. And this is going to take you to the download page for the smart client. And if you're using Access Optimizer in your system, then you can also have your Access Optimizer version published here for download as well. Now, you'll notice there's no management client here. What we want to do is we're going to add in, after installation, we're going to do a /admin. And when we hit enter, then we get the second page, which gives us a variety of different downloads that we can use. One of those is the management client installer. And to get to that download, you're just going to click the all languages, which will start the download. You'll also have here, in case you ever need reference, you've got the recording server installer, an event server installer, log server installer, mobile server installer, and an API gateway installer. Typically, those will be installed during your system setup, but as maybe your system grows or expands, you might need to revisit that page. All right, so once you have that downloaded and installed, then you log into it the same way you do into the smart client. And what we're presented with is a series of things. First thing we have is on the left-hand side of this pane, we have a series of modules. So we have a license module, a site information module, a recording servers module, failover servers module, and so on. These modules are where we're going to do the main part of our navigation in. We also have tabs across the bottom, and I'll show you an example of that here. So if I click on my recording server, this is the server hosting all of my cameras. And you can have one or multiple recording servers depending on your system size and construction. On my recording server, I now have these tabs across the bottom here. Information, so info, storage, failover, multicast network, and so on. You also see that in other places. For example, if we jump to a camera and we just select one of our cameras, info, settings, streams, tabs, and so on. So we have tabs across the bottom that that appear in context to the module that we're looking at. All right, so that's just a quick overview. What we're going to talk about today, we're going to look at users within Milestone. We're going to look at roles. We're going to look at retention profiles, recording methodologies, and I've got a list of some extra things we can cover depending on time. But that's the main focus and the goal of what we want to try and cover. With the users. So Milestone has it's in the security section. There is a roles module and a basic users module. Basic users exist only within Milestone XProtect. The users that are created here cannot be used anywhere else, and they don't exist anywhere else. So your basic users are only for within the context of this installation on this management server of Milestone. Basic users are great, though, in a couple scenarios. If you have a shared login that you want multiple people to leverage, or maybe a login that you want set up on a desktop, and that desktop is just always logged in to Milestone, basic users are a great use case for that. Alternatively, we can also leverage domain users. So if your Milestone is set up and installed in a domain environment, leveraging a domain account that we use as a service account on that on that server, then we can also leverage domain users and domain groups. And then the third option there is an external IDP. IDP is an acronym for Identity Provider, and an external IDP is an external application or service where you can store and manage user identity information and provide user authentication services to Milestone or other systems. And you can associate an external IDP with Milestone to leverage that group of centralized users into Milestone. Now, this is a relatively new feature to Milestone in we'll say the last 2 years, that has had a version by version increase in features and supportability to the different devices that it can interact with, or the different IDPs that it can interact with. So as it stands today in 2024 R1, Milestone's external IDPs are compatible with OpenID Connect. So any IDP that is compatible or supports OpenID Connect. So that would allow you to leverage your user structures and user profiles there, pull those into Milestone, and then you grant permissions within Milestone based on those centralized users. Same process with domains, except it's built in a little more seamlessly. You don't have to create those connections. In a domain, simply having your Milestone server running, first the servers have to be joined to the domain, and then you have to be running with a service account that is authorized to basically do .NET queries against the domain for user credentials. All right, so today we're going to start looking at basic users. So here we are on our basic users module, and you see I've already got a list here. We're going to create a new basic user, and we're going to use this throughout some other portions of our training today. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to right-click in the white space area, and I'm going to do Create Basic User. There's also a keyboard shortcut if you are into using keyboard shortcuts. Now that I have done that, we have a pop-up, a prompt for New Basic User. And it's going to ask us for some information. So we're just going to create a test user. So I'll just call it test. You can make that however you want. And then we're going to give it a description, test user for demo purposes. Now we need a password. Milestone is going to enforce the password policies of whatever that or however that policy is set on the management server. So if your management server is not enforcing complex password, then Milestone is not going to enforce complex passwords. But if your management server, the Windows, we're talking about the Windows security policies on your management server, if a complex password or a customized complex password is required there, then Milestone is going to honor that and do that same thing. Now, things that can set and override that. So even if you change it on your management server, if you are domain joined, your domain policies more than likely are going to specify or override anything that you set locally. So on a domain, typically it's your domain environment and your domain policies, your group policies that are going to determine your password complexity requirements. Typically though, in just a Windows environment, on fresh installs with current server OS, it tends to be about 12 characters or more, require one uppercase, lowercase, a symbol, and a number. All right, so I am going to use a password generator, and I'm going to create a password. Now, one thing I like to do, because we often copy and paste passwords, or we type it and then for some reason it doesn't work. If you are like me, I tend to typo things a lot. So when setting this up, just for ease of mind, for simplicity, to reduce the amount of trouble later, I will paste the password here in my description box. This lets me make sure that there's no extra spaces at the end. No weird characters formatted in a way I didn't expect. You'd be surprised at the number of things that can come up trying to copy and paste. But from here, now I can copy and paste it down to my password boxes. And now our next option is a checkbox here to force a basic user to change password on next login. This checkbox showed up mid-2023, maybe the start of 2023. But what it does is whatever password I put in here, I create this user, I send that username and password to whoever's going to be using it. Well, if they don't have an ability to, or they're not forced to change that password, then I know the password that they're using, and that reduces security. And so if you are generating basic users for somebody else, put in a temporary user, put in a temporary password. Check the box to force the basic user to change their password on next login. And then they will be presented with that option when they log in. They'll have to set the password to something that they decide and pick. And then at that point, what we have here in our box is no longer valid. So typically, once I've pasted that into the box, I may leave it also for a couple days in case for some reason they lost the password and I have to come back and get it again. Then there's that option there. So if you are on a domain, it is, yes, absolutely better to use domain users. But not everybody's Milestone is joined to a domain. And there are a couple situations where maybe a domain user wouldn't be practical. For example, oftentimes universities will have on-prem police departments, or really any company might have an on-prem security department. And you have a series of monitors up on the wall in the security office that are always on. And it's not logical or feasible for, hey, shift change, who's going to log out and who's going to log in. And then that login also gives them access to a whole bunch of different things. Now, ideally, yes, you would just create a domain user that is specific for that purpose, but some organizations won't do that. Some organizations won't create a domain account unless it's tied to a specific person, because that person then becomes responsible for it. So in that instance, you would you could create a basic user for that particular application to say, these monitors running on the wall are running as a basic user. My users at their desk are still logging in with their domain users. All right. As we move on, we have also gained a status option here in the recent years. And the options are enabled or locked out. This is helpful if you need to remove somebody's permissions without deleting their account or deleting their permissions. Oftentimes, in my case, one way I use this is I will grant temporary access for particular users or vendors or partners, whoever comes in. I will create a user for them and I will grant them temporary access. Well, rather than delete that and then recreate it every time that they need it, I create it once, I let them use it, and when they are done, then I will lock out that user. The logging and everything is still there. The permissions and everything all is still there. I don't have to go and recreate anything, and they've got that user still. So we're going to leave this enabled. I'm going to click OK, and you'll see that test user pop up on our list. And now all of the fields there that we were looking at, except for the password boxes, show. If we need to edit that, if a user forgets their password for any reason, we can edit basic user and we can put in a new password if we need to. All right, so that gets somebody a login, but it doesn't get them access to anything. So we're going to look at how we take that basic user and grant them access by adding them to a role. Before we move down that list, though, just a couple other things on the domain users. Actually, we'll do that in roles, I think. Okay, so if we jump over to roles. Roles are divided out in a series of groups. So there is always an administrator's role that is full, complete, and unrestricted access to the system. This is people like the guys taking care of the system. Maybe Stone has a temporary user in there so that we can program the cameras and add them as we monitor or complete projects for you. Maybe it's you've got an auditing team. Maybe they have full access or whatever it might be. This group is always there. It can't be deleted. But you can create additional groups specific for the needs that you want. There's a couple different ways to create these groups. There's a couple different ideas on how to structure them. One is to create a role that is labeled based on the functionality that role will have. Like I could create a role, add a role, live only. And anybody I add to this role, assuming we set the permissions correctly, which we'll run through, anybody I add to this role will get live view only, meaning no playback, no export, no anything else. We could create another one that could be live/playback. And now we have that as a role. And then you can continue down the process there. You could do live playback export or how it needs to be. A user can exist in multiple roles. It generally is an additive structure with one exception. If you have a role that explicitly denies a permission, then that deny tends to override any of the access granted from other roles. So if you are putting users in multiple roles and they have kind of some weirdness in what their permissions are, you might look at just structuring or building a new role that is specific to those combined functions in the way that you need, instead of just adding them to multiple. All right. The other approach to creating roles could be more based on user groups. So a way to do this, and this is how I tend to do it myself, and it's what I've done here. Like we've got demo users, we've got neighbor access. We've got some people in the building next to us that had a break-in, and so I granted them access to their camera, to our cameras, so that they could review that video. We've got Vegas local users. This is common for larger organizations where you have a lot of users to structure it this way, and where you say, hey, this is my accounting department. This is my administration group. This is my owner's team. This is maybe my police department, my security team, my supervisors, whatever it is. So you can base the roles more on a person's title or their job function as one way of doing that. So you can do it either way. You can do both ways. You can do a combination. But find the structure or the methodology that's going to work for you, and then just build it out. So in our example here, we do have a live only. So let's start working through that live only setup. I have name live only. You can add in a description here if you want. Live only views, no recording. No, we'll say no playback, no export. Maybe a high level overview of what that role is, so that when you come back and you see the name, it's a little more clear what that name is and what roles are part of that. All right. Default management client profile, default smart client profile. These, we're going to possibly talk about smart client profiles if we have time near the end. The management client profiles and the smart client profiles. Think of this as a way to modify the application, the client. So, for example, in my smart client, depending on how I structure my smart client profiles, I can say, you don't even get to see the playback tab. So, for example, down here across the bottom, I have my live and playback. I can take away and hide completely the playback button. We can hide the exports tab. We can hide the search tab. We can hide the alarm manager tab. We can customize this layout, the way that the application looks, in a lot of different ways. Now, there is a difference between what we show and hide in the application versus permissions. So those are two different things. They can be done in parallel. And of course, even if you have playback permissions, if I hide the playback tab and if I hide the independent playback button, then you're not really going to have a great way of accessing playback. But there might be some places where maybe you could still do that. So roles and the way that the program looks, or the way that the client looks, are two separate functions that can be used together. All right. Moving down the list, and management client profiles is the same way. So I can grant a series of users access to the management client, and I can take away different modules. We could hide rules and events. We could hide the security. We could say you only get access to server logs. Whatever the configuration is, there's a lot of flexibility in that. Moving down that list here, default time profile. This is just a selection or a definition of what the default time profile is for this user. So I can say standard office hours, and we'll see how that trickles down in just a minute. So we'll skip the evidence lock just a minute to visit the time profile. Only allow login within time profile. You see how it says default? That's referencing what we selected here. So we can say always, and we can say standard office hours here, or we can do that however we need. The method you choose is going to pick on, going to depend on a couple other things down the road. All right, default evidence lock profile. Again, that's kind of similar to the smart client profile. What evidence lock features or profiles does this user group have access to? So typically, there's just only the one default selected or available. You would have to go and create some additional ones in order to do that. Okay. Allow smart client login. Do I want this group to have access to the full smart client? Yes or no? It's a checkbox. Do I want to allow mobile client login? Do I want to allow this group to leverage the iPhone or Android app in order to view cameras from my mobile device? Do I want to allow or not allow web client login? So is this user allowed to use the web client in order to access the cameras? And then login authorization required. This checkbox is going to mean that a second person is going to have to enter their credentials after you enter yours. So you would log in, put in your username, your password, and then you hit connect. And it will then prompt for the authorization to let you do that. So this is a kind of like two-factor on the job, in-person type authorization required, where a second person is going to have to say, yes, I'm allowing you to log in. Make users anonymous during PTZ sessions. So anybody who is part of this user group, if they start moving or controlling a PTZ, it's not going to present your username as, Adam is controlling this PTZ. It would just say anonymous. This is really helpful or useful for security groups or particularly police departments. So if you have a on-prem police department, you might apply this to their role so that as they're using a PTZ camera and looking around for whatever specific thing they might be looking at, if there happens to be somebody else viewing the camera, they don't look at it and go, oh, that's Officer so-and-so. What's he looking at? I wonder what's going on campus, and then, start spreading rumors or causing panic or whatever the situation might be there. Okay, moving down the list. So we're going to allow Smart Client. We'll allow mobile and web as well, just as a default stance from my use case. Yours might vary. And I'll just say default login within time profile. All right, moving down the list, we're going to go to users and groups. So here, if I hit add, I get a pop-up that asks me, do I want to add a basic user or a Windows user? So here I'm going to select basic user. And then we get a list of our basic users. This gives us the name there, and we can check the box to select. So we created our test account, and then I can hit OK. You also do, if you forgot to create the basic user first, you also do have a new button here that you can click and add in and create a user right there, kind of on the fly. All right, so we'll say test, and we'll hit OK. Now, for those of you who are domain joined, you're going to use a Windows user. And my laptop is not joined to a traditional domain, so it's not going to function for me the way that I want. But you'll get that standard pop-up that you're used to for seeing, finding domain users where you can add their names, and you can hit the check names. You can search for groups. If I were to pull this up on my server, I could show you. But you can add domain users directly as individual users, or if you're in a larger organization, it may be even more advantageous to leverage domain groups. So you would add domain groups in that same method. You would just, instead of searching for that particular user, you search for the group, and the group will then populate and show in the list. The advantage here is that if you have already automated processes tied to HR movements to say, here's my onboarding, when this person is onboarded, depending on their job position, title, or role, HR is going to automatically add them to the specific domain groups that they need to be part of. You don't then have to manage user access individually or outside of that, because if they get added to that domain group, and that domain group has permissions within a role in Milestone, then anybody added to that group is going to inherit the permissions of that group. And then again, on your exiting strategy, on your offboarding side, if an employee is terminated, their domain accounts should be getting disabled, and then they should be getting stripped out of all the groups. If that happens, then they will lose their access based on that group permission as well. So if you're in that larger environment or you have domain groups, and if you're currently just adding individuals, I'd encourage you to look at ways to leverage groups within your domain. A lot of organizations have built tools around automatically or even manually adding individuals and users to groups as well. So you might inquire about that. All right, so we've got our user added. Here we're just using a basic user. External IDP, if you have that set up, and that's a whole other discussion for another day, then you would add in your external IDP users here. So we'll move down the list all across our tabs. Now we're going to come to overall security. Now, overall means across the whole system. So here, if I go to cameras and I grant full control, that means it's every camera in my whole system that this user will get access to, and every function of that camera in my whole system. So when you are using overall security, there's not a way to individually grant or deny access to particular cameras. And here's what this will look like if you try. So right now I have full control to all cameras on all functions on the cameras. So we'll go to devices. First, we'll save changes. We'll go to the device tab. The device tab is where I would pick individually what specific devices I want this user to have access to. So I'll expand out all cameras. We'll pick one of our exterior cameras. We'll do our front door sidewalk. You'll notice that everything is checked and grayed out. I cannot modify these here. That grayed out is a clue that this permission is set by an overall security policy. So be careful in how you apply your overall security. It is useful, for example, if we have that administrators group or that owners group or that audit group or that PD or security group. Those are typically the groups that we want to have access to all cameras. We don't want to have to say, all right, I just added another camera and it was for some department receptionist. We don't have to go and keep updating groups after the fact or permissions after the fact. We can just say, all right, these groups, we know we want them to have all cameras, and so we can come in and say, grant them particular permissions. Now, if we kind of start here at the management server, there's a couple things that are at a minimum required. Connect needs to be allowed. If connect is not allowed, so connect to the management server, if that's not allowed, then they're not going to be able to log in. Milestone will deny their login. All right. A couple of things there. If you want to have a user that leverages APIs or manages federated site hierarchy, these are mostly for permissions inside the management client here. But connect is one that I've seen people remove, and then they call us and say, hey, why can't my users connect? And that's because that checkbox. Recording servers, again, for a typical person who's going to be viewing cameras inside the smart client, you're not going to necessarily want to grant any permissions here for that. Failover servers, same thing. This is more targeted towards management client access. Mobile servers, same thing, targeted towards management client access. Hardware, same thing. When we get into more of the devices, the cameras, the microphones, the speakers, the metadata, inputs, outputs, and other functionality within Milestone like Smart Wall, view groups, user-defined events, this is where we start to see that those permissions tied into what a user gets in the management, in the smart client. So from my live only, we're not gonna do any full controls, but what we will do is, let's say we get read access. That means this user gets to know that this camera exists. It will show up in the lists, in the directories inside of the smart client. If I don't want a user group to even be aware that these cameras exist, I can either leave it unchecked, which if they're in multiple roles, then remember that additive nature. Or if I explicitly deny it, then again, in that multiple roles additive feature, then this deny would override the other options. Now, I can't think of a scenario where you would say across the board as an overall security policy, you're going to deny read access to the cameras, because that seems kind of critical to the basic functionality. So we're going to do read. I want this group to know that all cameras exist. I want this group to be able to view live, because this is my live only. View restricted live. Restricted live is a feature that was released towards the end of 2023, where you can say if there's for example an event happening on your property right now, you might not want people with access to those cameras to be either randomly browsing, or maybe it's something that they look at on a normal basis, but to see, oh, there's a police presence right now happening, and start watching what's going on. Maybe you want to restrict that. So there's a process in the Smart Client to restrict live access for a short term. Same thing with playback access for a short term. And do we want this group to be able to override that policy, or view that restricted live, or view those restricted recordings? In this instance, I'm going to say no. I'm also going to, no playback. Now, I can explicitly deny these things, or I can leave them unchecked. If I leave it unchecked, again, that additive nature of a user being in more than one roles is going to allow their access from other roles to combine with this one to give them access to only certain devices for example, playback. If I deny, then across the board, then that will override anything else. Read sequences, that is in the playback. Read sequences, meaning can I see the timeline data of what's happening there. Smart search, do I want to allow smart search? Smart search is on a camera tile. It's the icon down here that says smart search. And that opens up a new window with our search features, or it's this search tab here. So I'm going to skip that one. No permissions granted means also no access. Export, no. Maybe this one I'll explicitly say, no, this user cannot export. Or create bookmarks. Yeah, we're viewing live video, so we should be able to create bookmarks there. Read bookmarks, no. Once they exist, I don't want you to be able to go back and read them. Or maybe we say yes. Edit bookmarks, no. Delete bookmarks, no. Create and extend evidence locks. Probably my live group, only group, I don't want creating evidence locks. So we'll do a full-on deny there. Again, or I could just leave it unchecked, because if it's not selected, then they don't get those permissions from this role. Delete and reduce evidence locks, create and extend live and playback restrictions, read live and playback restrictions, delete and reduce live and playback restrictions. Anyway, this list just goes on and on and on. Some other key ones here. Manual PTZ. Well, if I'm viewing live cameras, I might want to give this group access to PTZ cameras to actually move them around. Activate PTZ presets and patrolling profiles? Sure. Manage PTZ presets or patrolling profiles? We're going to say no. Lock, unlock PTZ presets? We're say nope. Reserve a PTZ session? Maybe we'll let them reserve it, but not release it. Delete recordings? No. Lift privacy masks? No. Manage security? No. Okay. So that has given our user a series of permissions. We can keep going. Do we want this user to have access to any audio, to the microphones or speakers? I'm going to say no. We'll skip over those then. Metadata. Okay, yeah, we'll let you read and view live the metadata, and everything else is tied to playback, so we'll skip the rest. Inputs, no, I don't want this user to be able to activate any inputs or outputs. We'll skip those. Smart wall, do I want this user to be able to interact with my smart wall at all? We'll say no. View groups. All right, let's pause here on view groups for a minute, because this is critical. View groups is my list here on the left in my Smart Client under views. So ALE is a view group. Demo views is a view group. Internal is a view group. Live only, live playback. So here's a good thing to note. I didn't manually create this live only view group. View groups are automatically created when you create a role. So we created our live only role that created also a live only view group. I'm going to hit save here, and we're going to jump over to the view groups. So view groups right here under client, view groups. Here's my live only. Here's my live playback. I can delete these. I can create additional ones. Here's where this becomes critical. When we talk about how users gain access to cameras, what cameras they have permissions to, part of that discussion is also what view group structures do we get access to. So I have a demo view group here, which is a bunch of views that I have pre-built for demonstration purposes, showing different access control elements, body worn, looking at cameras based on the model number, functions, however you want to structure those view groups. Some people do it by area, so we can do location-based view groups. Some organizations might have a master set of views, like a default set of view groups where maybe the admins create those views for other people to use, but don't give people permissions to edit those views. And so they build them as they go. But maybe your security team wants to create their own view group so they could have their own workflows and see the things that are important to them on their shift, because there's also differences between day shift and night shift and what they might want to see. So anybody who has access to view a view group is going to see the structure of that whole view group. Now, whether they have permissions to view the individual cameras on those views, that is governed by their permissions to the cameras. So, for example, if I grant a user access to my demo views view group and I deny them access to my body-worn cameras, then they will see the demo views, they'll see body worn, they'll see that there's an all body worn cameras layout, but it won't populate any cameras for them to see because they do not have permissions to those cameras. So you might structure your view groups like maybe here's my auditing group, maybe here's internal affairs, maybe a view group for, whatever. You can structure those in however you want. And we govern access to those through the view groups. Maybe administrators, you want them to have full control across all view groups. Or maybe you might say, hey, this is my live only. I do not want overall security on view groups. We'll do that explicitly with individual views. Individual view groups. And actually, let's do that right now since we're on this tab or on this setting. So if I change from overall security over to view groups, here we have the list of view groups. So we still have live only selected. So we're talking about that group, that role. My live only, I'm going to give them access to my demo views, but I'm only going to give them access to read and operate. I don't want them to edit it, and I don't want them to delete it. That way I can maintain the integrity of those views that I built to make sure that they're not going to get messed with or modified or deleted or changed or whatever it might be. Okay. We can also give them their live only view group, and maybe we give them full access to that so that they can create whatever custom views or layouts that they want within that. But then we give them the space to do that. You'll notice that there is one view group here that does not even show up on the list, and that is the private view group. If you're not familiar with that, you'll see it right here, private. Every user in Milestone will get a private view group, and that is tied to their specific user login. That is synced across anywhere that they do log in. So if they are on one workstation, they log in and create some private views. If they move to another workstation and log in, those track and will be on that new workstation as well. But here, these view groups are shared across the entire role. So everybody who is in my live only will have access to this live only. And so we can share views and structures within that. All right, so we've looked at the limited access and then the give them all access to individual specific view groups. Let's jump back over to the overall security policy, save our changes. As we keep moving down the list, we have user-defined events, analytic events, generic events, and really the options just keep going. So here's what's key. Create a test user. And as you are building new roles to test and make sure that the functionality that you want is what they are actually going to get, leverage that test user in that group to test that access. And then look through it. Again, overall security is system-wide permissions. Let's jump over to specific devices. Okay. Let's say that our live-only view group, our live-only role, live-only, no playback, no export, we've given them access to all of our cameras in live, but now let's say that we want them to be able to run and interact with the intercoms. So let's do this. All microphones. And let me pick, question is, did I name them? I did. Front intercom. Okay. We're going to give you read, listen live. We're not going to do playback for this group. Bookmarks. We have bookmarks on the video, so I don't need to worry about bookmarks necessarily on the audio side of it, and not worrying about evidence locks. Okay. Now I can select my next one, read, listen live. Okay. And that's for my 2 microphones on my 2 intercoms. Well, the other half of that equation is, well, they might need some speakers in order to talk out. All right, so we can pick our 2 speakers. So here is my exterior front intercom, read, listen live, and that should be good. And then warehouse, read, listen live. So that's going to give anybody who has access to my live only, they're going to be able to see the camera live, listen to the microphone live, and talk back through the speaker live. All right. But only for those 2 devices that we selected. Now, I need to call out something here that there's often a lot of confusion around. If I, we'll do it with microphones. So if I grant permissions to a collection of devices using one of the folder structures, okay? So here's my 2 intercoms. If I select this, you'll see that we have the 2 checkboxes. Inside of that is those 2 intercoms. All right. Let's say I'm also going to give you access to maybe the microphones on my we'll do the F91. So on my F91, I have 2 microphones. If I select my group, okay, I can mass edit those settings for everything that's in the group. But if I then, maybe I install another F91 unit somewhere and I activate the microphone for it, and I put that microphone in this same group, it doesn't mean that the permissions are going to be inherited to that new microphone because it's in this group and I check the boxes for this group. That's not how this works. When I am selecting a folder, what I'm doing is telling Milestone that for the devices that are in this folder right now, I am bulk applying these settings. It is not stuck or tracked on the folder level. All we're doing is modifying the individual devices that are currently contained within that folder in bulk at that moment. So when you come back later and you add more cameras or more devices, those settings are not inherited simply because you put them in that group. You have to go and manually update those. All right, moving on from that. So we're going to take away permissions to the F91 because we're just going to stick with the network intercom. Moving down the list, we did microphones, speakers, metadata, inputs, outputs. You can customize those how you want. PTZ. All right, so we did allow PTZ access. So let's look at those settings. You'll notice that the manual activate are grayed out, as well as the reserve PTZ sessions, because we did that within the overall security. We can say individually, like maybe you can release a reserved PTZ session on a select handful of cameras. We could do that. But here's another setting that's really important, and it's this PTZ priority. Users in Milestone, when they are accessing PTZ cameras, how do you control whether one user can take control of a camera used by another user? Well, that's done with the priority. So for example, you might set your PD group or your security teams to the highest level, okay, which is 30,000. Okay. So we can say 30,000. If you get something out of range, it's going to pop up and tell you must be between 1 and, sorry, I misspoke, 32,000. So 32,000. Okay, so that would give this user group priority over anybody else in the system on PTZ camera manual moves. If this is a low priority group, maybe I might set it down to 100. So there's a lot of, obviously 1 to 32,000, there's a lot of different possible levels in there. Most people tend to break it out into the levels of 1,000, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, and so on. For this group, live only, I'm going to probably set them pretty low, because if I have a higher priority request from a different user group, I'm going to give them priority over it. This PTZ priority is also leveraged by your rules. So if you have a rule that is moving a PTZ camera, then you grant that rule a priority. And then depending on how it ranks, 32,000 being the highest priority, 1 being the lowest priority, the rule may not be able to do it because maybe somebody else is using the camera. The same thing happens also with your patrolling profiles. Your patrolling profiles get a priority level as well. And maybe that patrolling profile is valid and active and running, and we give it a priority of 1,000. A user with priority over 1,000 can control that camera, but a user under 1,000, because the patrolling priority is set to 1,000, it's in use. And then if we, maybe somebody with 100 priority, they're not going to be able to override that patrolling. So there's different ways you can structure that and architect it. We're going to stick low and just do 100, and we'll just do it on all cameras. So I'll just come up here. Checkbox means selected for everything in that group. The unchecked is not selected for everything in that group. Anytime you see this box with a dash in it, means it's a mixed selection. So we have that shown here between these two cameras. So what I can do is I can say select the whole group. There's that. And we'll say 1,000. I said 100, so we'll do 100. And I don't want to grant any other permissions, so we'll leave it at that. Okay, so that is PTZ. We'll hit save. Speech. Do I want this person to be able to speak out too? So the live only, when we were looking at the devices, again, this was listen to the live or listen to the speaker. So if somebody else is talking, I'd be able to hear them talking live. But to actually be able to use that talk back, I need to be able to give them permissions specifically to that. So speak, yes. Again, within a time profile. So see how it says default? This default ties back to the default that we selected on the info tab. So default time profile, standard office hours. So if we go back to speech, default is what we're selecting for that time profile. And so that's going to only be within standard office hours. Okay, speak priority, high, medium, low, very high, very low. We'll just leave them as medium. And then we'll do it on this other device as well. And moving down the list, we'll save changes, Control S, or you can click the button in the top left. All right, so speech, Remote recordings. Do we want to be able to grant people access to retrieve or whatever remote recordings? Smart wall. We cover this in our smart wall session. External events. So if I have like I could create this as an overlay button, or if there's some kind of an event trigger that I want somebody to have access to, we can grant them specific actions or access to specific external events. View groups. We looked at the view groups already. Servers. Okay, if I have multiple sites in a federated structure, from here, I would say that this user logging into my top level hierarchy has access also to see and view these lower level hierarchies. Now, there's some caveats to that we'll cover in a different session when we talk about federation, because you still have to grant permissions at those local individual sites as well. They're not pushed down from the top. Matrix, if you leverage any matrices, then you would grant permissions to those here. Alarms. So now we have the ability to say alarms, yes, you can manage, view, disable, receive notifications, edit alarm settings. And then you can also do this for individual alarms. So maybe your live view only group doesn't get any alarms, but maybe your security team gets door forced, door held open, access denied. Maybe your administrators group gets a camera went offline, something else, or whatever it might be. Access control. If you have access control integrations, this is where you can grant access to leverage those integrations. LPR, if you're using LPR, what permissions do they get? Incidents is a whole other thing on its own. This is like an incident management tool built into Milestone that showed up 2023 sometime as well. And healthcare is if you're specifically using the healthcare version of Milestone. We are not. This is just the standard version, and so we don't have any options there. And then Access Optimizer, if you're leveraging that, would show you what options for Access Optimizer. So that's kind of everything there for a role. Now let's leverage our test user, and let's log in as our test user. And if you recall, I left that box to force the basic user to change their password. I left that selected. So we're going to do basic authentication because I'm using a basic user, and I'm going to say test, and I'm going to grab my password that we generated. Let me make sure I don't grab that trailing space at the end. Okay, I'm going to paste that here, and we're going to say connect. Now, I am not running certificates on my servers right now, and so I get a pop-up warning that says either the server's not available or it's not using the newest security model, which is just means encryption, whether that connection is encrypted or not. We hit allow. Okay, change your password to connect. Continuing will open your browser. I can hit continue. There's the browser. Now it's prompting me for my current username and my current password. I can click next. Okay, now we logged into the password change service is what we just did. It's going to again prompt us for our current password, because if I log in, get distracted, and walk away, somebody's going to, potentially could come and put in their own password instead of what I want. All right, so I'm going to grab a new password here. Going to copy and paste that and hit save. Successfully changed. Now I can close this and minimize my browser, and we can paste our new password there, and I can hit connect, and it's not going to prompt me for a password change now. Now it's going to let me proceed. As soon as you see retrieving configuration, you know that that user has successfully authenticated against the management server. All right, let me pull this up to the correct window here. All right, so here we go. We are logged in as our test user. I can click on my user icon over here or just hover over it, and it's going to tell me the name of the user. I can click on it, and it tells me as well, test, and it's a basic user. I have the system that we're connected to, and I can log out from there. All right, so here we have our demo views. We granted access to demo views, live only, and private. Demo views, we said you can view them and operate them, but you cannot edit them. So let me hit setup, and we get this, oh, you can't do this. I can take things out, but it shouldn't save it. It did. That's peculiar. I wonder if I added a permission that I shouldn't have. Well, I'll have to rebuild that later. Let me jump out of setup. Yep. See, this is why we test. Because what you select may not work the way that you anticipate. That might be the operate that I added. But alternatively, I can hide the setup button using a Smart Client profile. All right. So we have live only. Now notice my playback button is not there because I don't have playback permitted on this machine, or for this user. But I have all my demo views. I have my live only views, and there's nothing created there. We could create one and go through that process of creating a live only view. And we'll just do that really quick to prove that we can create it, and we can select a camera and pull it out. So this looks alarming, but it's not. And here's why. The message is unable to display preview from camera exterior PTZ, insufficient user rights. The reason why is because when you're in setup mode, you get kind of like a ghosted, grayed out image of what that camera looks like. That is from recording, not from live. As soon as I exit setup, we get our live view of what that camera is seeing. All right, so far our live view is doing what we anticipated, except for letting us modify or delete tiles out of views. We'll have to look at why that is. Let me just look at my list here, make sure I haven't skipped over anything. And again, if you have questions as we go through, please drop them in the chat and we'll address those. Okay. So yeah, so that's basically the gist of views. Moral of the story, leverage a test user as you create a view so that you can make sure that you structure those correctly and that they get the operation they want. Just really quick, since we're kind of in that topic, Smart Client profiles. We'll do a demo users, and I'll come back and fix this later because I don't want to actually take this away. But in our, if you look at this, this is what we would see for like settings inside of the Smart Client if you've ever dug into the settings. But we also have different options. So like for my live, I can take away live mode, or I could take away playback mode. I can take away setup mode. So we can say setup mode is unavailable. Save. Now, if I come back to my roles and we do live only, go back to my info tab for my default Smart Client, or so for my Smart Client profile is going to do demo users. Save that change. Now, if I come back to that user we have logged in, this one here, and if I hit F5 to refresh, well, actually I can't refresh because that shortcut has not been created for this user. If you haven't done this in your system, this might be a good note to jot down. It's really handy to have a refresh button to reload the configuration or whatever the settings are. Most everything that you can modify and change can be just refreshed. Certain things, like if you're playing with access control elements of it, you might have to log all the way out and log back in to get those changes. But we want to reload the server configuration and assign that. So F5 is a reload server configuration. I can hit F5 now. It's going to, same as what we're logging in, this is that retrieving configuration message that we see there. And what we should see is that once this loads, our setup button, which we made unavailable, should disappear. There it goes. There's no setup button there anymore. So that's just a quick example of what you can do there with some of the Smart Client profiles. Okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit now, get out of the roles and permissions and users, and we're going to start talking about recording. So I have a recording server. If you have multiple, then you'll see multiple in the list. In my tabs across the bottom, we can look at the storage tab. Once this comes up, there we go. Okay. At the very top of this storage, we have a section called Storage Configuration. We can have multiple configurations, and we'll talk through what some of these customizations might be. One thing you can see right here is that I have a profile called 14 days, and if we're looking at that profile, we have a tier 1 recording, a tier 2 recording, and our max retention is 14 days. If I come to my 45 days, then we have a tier 1 recording on the D drive, a tier 2 recording on the E drive, and we're deleting anything older than 45 days. I have another one here, Tiger Wasabi Cloud. These are cameras that are recording locally, but then as soon as we hit that second tier, they're immediately being pushed out to cloud storage. Where these show up, the 14, 45, and Tiger Wasabi, when you add a camera, you get to select which storage profile you add it to. If you need to change a camera post after the fact, then if you go to that device and you go to the record tab, you'll see here storage of 45 days, and I can hit the select, and I can change that to a different storage profile. Okay, jumping back over to the recording servers, looking at the storage profiles. Let's talk about these tiers. Tier 1 is where our video is going to go to first. And it might be the only tier that you have. Milestone is very customizable in that you can have a single tier, 2 tiers, 3 tiers, 4 tiers. I don't know that I've found a limit, but I don't know that I've actually set up more than 3 or 4 either. One thing you want to be careful of or aware of. Right now, any cameras, we'll use my 45 days here because it's the more typical situation. The bulk of the cameras in my system come to my 45 days, and so they are first recorded to the D drive, to a folder called MD. I like to abbreviate the media database as MD. So the D drive, MD, is where everything comes initially. My very next step is archive recordings older than 4 hours at the next archive schedule. In this context, archive just means I'm going to transfer the recordings from one tier to the next tier. So anything older than 4 hours, when this gets run next, is going to get moved from my D drive to my E drive. Now, on this server, my D drive is it's a BCD server, and so it's a BCD video accelerator, which is basically it's a PCIe storage slot with RAID 1 NVMEs on it. So I'm recording to basically flash storage or SSD storage as my initial tier. Now, we do that in a lot of cases because the amount of video coming into a server might be more video coming in than can be written down quickly. Keep in mind, we have all of the video streams coming here. Now, not all video streams are being written to the disk. Only things that we say record are being written to the disk. And then what I can do is at a later date and time, or in off hours, maybe when the system is being used less, maybe there's less motion happening, so my disk IOs are lower, I can then tier my storage. I can have it transfer from my fast disk to my slow disk. So I have 85 terabytes here on my slow disk, but I only have, basically 1.5 terabytes on my fast disk. So if we look at what that is, how that's set up. So we have our storage and recording streams. We give it a name. We give it a path. We tell it the retention time in this tier. So this is my minimum retention time in this tier. In this case, I have 4 hours. And then maximum storage size in this tier. In this case, I just put the max size of that disk, which is 1,450 gigabytes. And then signing is generally something that you're going to want to check the box for. It is Milestone's way of providing forensic signatures that the video from the camera to the server to the export have not been tampered with. And we talk about that in great depth when we're going through the exporting process. Encryption. Do you want to use encryption in your recordings? And the password set is not available, I think, in this on the first tier. All right, so that is those initial settings. And then what we do is we say our tier 2, if we want one. And we have the buttons to add, edit, or delete archive tiers below. So I'm just going to right click or double click on this to edit the existing one to look at it. So we just called this one tier 2. It's going to the E drive. And our max retention in this tier is 45 days. And I have my max drive size there. Now the schedule. Recall where it says archive recordings older than 4 hours at the next archive schedule. What is that schedule? We set that on the tier immediately following. So here we have occurs every 12 hours between midnight and midnight. And if we edit that, we can look at what the options are. You can do daily, weekly, monthly. You can do every 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. If we change that to weeks, you can specify that. And what is the occurrence? Occurs at a single point in time or occurs every so many hours. You could say 6 hours between start time and end time. And then you set your schedule there. Reduce frame rate. If you're running in Motion JPEG, then you can actually specify, I want this video, which maybe is 30 frames per second Motion JPEG, to turn into 5 frames per second Motion JPEG. Then you can set that here. There is a note for MPEG, H.264, H.265, basically any of the new modern efficiencies. It can only be reduced down to the keyframe. So these high efficiency codecs are comprised of keyframes and filler frames, full frames and filler frames. Obviously, we can't reduce it further than that. So there's just a note there on what that grooming or what that reduced frame rate is going to do. We could add an additional tier if we wanted to. We could say, here's archive 2, and we can point it to a path. We select our path, and then we go. Now, a couple things about this path, and this is really critical. You do not want to leverage a storage location in more than one path. Let me rephrase that in a different way. I'm going to the D drive for my first tier. I do not want to set up a tier 2 to also go to the D drive, because what that's going to do is Milestone's actually going to try to copy and paste, think of it that way, copy and paste or cut and paste the recordings from here to here. And if I'm going from the D drive to the D drive, that's a lot of read IOPS and a lot of write IOPS that I'm taking up on my drive, which is already trying to record a whole bunch of video. And so don't do that. If you need to do multi-tier archiving, separate that out into different physical disks or RAIDs or whatever it may be. Don't even take a disk like don't take an 8 terabyte disk and partition it into 3 different drives. Don't do that either, because again, that's the same disk. It's the same IOPS limitation on that disk. So with multi-tier, every tier needs to be its own set or collection of disks, whether that's a single drive like what we're doing here on the DMD or a RAID like we're doing here on the E drive. All right, but if I did have a third disk, and also, please don't record video to the C drive, because what happens is if the C drive fills up, then your server will crash, and it can be difficult for users to log in to the server at that point to then clear up or clean up the problem, because when you log into a server, if you haven't logged into it before, or you haven't logged into it recently, your user profiles might have been cleared away or minimized to free up disk space, and you might not be able to log in to then solve the problem. So please never record video to the C drive. But you would specify the drive, again, the retention profile for this tier. And keep in mind that is cumulative. It's not like it's going to be 4 hours here, 45 days here, and if we did, like, we'll just do 15. It's not going to be 15 days on this next one. That's not quite how that works. Our next retention time would need to be, if we wanted to go an additional 15 days, it's going to be 45 plus 15, which is what? If I do my math quickly, it's 60. So I would say 60 days, and then the size, and then the schedule for that. All right. And again, so you can do that for multiple tiers. Here I have a 14-day, and I only have one device using my 14-day, and it's my we have a golf simulator here in the office, and on that golf simulator we have a slow motion camera. It's an Axis P1467. And it is running at 180 frames per second, watching people's golf swings, so that we can learn how to be better golfers. Not really. I wouldn't know how to tell you what to do anyway. But it's a fun use case for a slow motion camera. But I only have one camera doing that, and because it's a lot of data, high frame rate, I don't want to store that for the 45 days, because even right now, for example, at 14 days, it's using 2 terabytes. So if I were to extend that out to 45 days, I'm going to have one camera eating up 8 terabytes of space. All right, so we can separate that out. 45 days, here's all the devices using my 45-day profile. And one thing you'll notice, metadata, the cameras that are turned off, not being used, they're not recording anything, so it'll be 0 space. But the metadata, the microphones, the speakers, if I find a speaker here, here's a speaker. So all of these elements by themselves can have different recording or storage configuration profiles. So I could keep my video on a camera. I could say keep that for 45 days, but I could keep audio. Maybe I only keep audio for 5 days. So you can separate those out in creative ways. Or where I'm doing it here, where I'm pushing to the cloud, I have a smaller collection of cameras that are doing that. Or we could, with Tiger, we could take everything and push it to the cloud at the end. So that is our retention profiles. All right, if we move on down our list, the next thing we want to talk about is recording methodologies. And what I mean by this is there's typically 2 recording methods that people think of. I can record when a camera detects motion, or I can record continuously. There is a third one that here at Stone Security we like to call continuous keyframe with motion. So it's kind of a hybrid between the two. And this requires, we'll look at the easy ones first. So our recording methodologies are managed by the rules. So let's go to our rules module. And what we'll get here once it loads. All right, is the list of our rules. And you'll notice there's some default rules. This list sorts alphabetically. And so my personal preference, what I like to do is I like to just put an asterisk in front, an asterisk in front of anything with the default rule so that it always sorts to the top. Otherwise, these will sort down. Like I've got alarms, these would be down here after the calls. When I structure my rules, I like to kind of preface the rule with a tag to tell me what that rule is doing. So if I'm looking at my recording rules, well, here's rules that affect recording. Here's rules that are triggers to do different actions. Here's rules that are calls from intercoms into the system and whatever else you might be. So for continuous recording, this is pretty straightforward. We'll create a new one. So we'll call it record and continuous recording. And I can, if I want, I could do 24/7, something to just help explain better what that is. I can put that into, instead of putting it into the name, I could put it into the description. All right, so perform an action on event is the one that we want. And down here, I can click on the blue links because we need to specify what the events are. It's going to take just a second to load. My management client is running a little slow today. All right, so once we get our list of events, we can do that. And actually, I misspoke. We don't want event because what is the event? An event is a one-time trigger. We want to do in a time interval, and we're going to hit next. Okay, what is the time interval? Well, it's always because we want continuous always recording. Now, Milestone is going to force us to, you'll see it here in a minute, but it's going to force us to select a stop event. We'll see that. But anyway, so perform an action in a time interval always. I want to start recording immediately on recording device. Okay, well, what cameras do I want to record continuously? Well, this is where there is a device folder structure that may come in handy.
The best camera for continuous recording depends on...
And my Google is talking to me. When creating a folder structure, I like to do one called system groups. And inside that system groups, I like to do a collection of models. So we looked at this, we saw this earlier. Here's, all the Axis cameras, all the Hanwha cameras, whatever else it might be. So we can sort them out by model. There's reasons for that we'll talk about in a little bit. But I also have recording methods. So here's my recording methods. So I have a continuous keyframe with motion device group. I have a continuous recording and a motion only. So any device so in this instance, we're building a rule for continuous recording. Any device that I put in this continuous recording folder is going to be inherited in this rule. So perform an action in a time interval, always start recording immediately on continuous recording. And I'm going to select next. Okay, so here's that stop criteria. It's not going to let us pick a different option. But in the event that for some reason always, if that ever were to stop, what do we want it to do? Well, it's going to make us stop recording. Now that scenario doesn't exist because always means always. It just, the way that their rule structure is built forces us to make that selection. Okay, so we have that group or that rule for continuous recording that is affecting that group. Now, if I go to my cameras and if I go to my system groups, recording methods, my continuous recording, I don't have anything in here right now. So let's put some devices in. go to Edit Device Group Members, and let's pick a couple that are interior. Let's do some in the lobby. We'll just make this easy. We'll just pick everything in the lobby. We'll add that to the group. I can hit OK. And now you'll see that these cameras, even though there's no motion happening right now, they are now continuously recording. Now that's not something that I want to leave for very long because I actually don't want those to record continuously in my case. So I'm going to take that out, but I can leave the rule there because the rule is impacting what's in this folder, in this group. And there's nothing in that group right now, so my rule's not actually applying to anything. But that did turn on the continuous recording for that selection. Okay, the motion. So let's go back to rules. There is a default record on motion rule, which is perform an action on motion started from all cameras, start recording 3 seconds before on the device on which the event occurred, and perform stop action on motion stopped from all cameras, stop recording 3 seconds after. So here's where you can set your pre and post buffer if you need to modify that. Just as a caveat, there is one other location on the pre-buffer, and I'll show that to you really quickly. So on the pre-buffer, we have to set that on the record as well. So right here we have our pre-buffer. Where are we writing that data to? Memory or disk? Anything over 30 seconds is going to force you to write it to the disk, but we can do memory. And how long do we want that pre-buffer to be? Well, we have two things here. We can set our pre-buffer to be 5 seconds or 10 seconds, but if the rule only says 3 seconds, we're only going to get 3 seconds. If we set our rule to 10 seconds, then any camera where we have 10 seconds entered here will get the 10-second pre-buffer. And other cameras where we get 3 seconds is what our setting is, will get the 3-second pre-buffer. So you can kind of mix and match it a little bit that way, but you have to keep, for your rules side of that, you need to keep that in mind of the max pre-buffer that you want to use across your system. And then individually on the cameras, you can specify what you want for that. Okay. So if we go back to our rules, we have our default motion rule. That one you can pretty much leave alone because at a minimum, if there is motion on a camera, you want to make sure that you are recording. You might also then have your continuous recording. These are not going to conflict. It's not like having a camera that's recording continuously and then motion is detected and that gets triggered as well. It's not like we're going to double record or have a conflict in that way. So don't worry about that. All right, so those two are easy. Now let's talk about the keyframe with motion. And I want to show it to you first so that you have a concept of what we're trying to do. I'm going to pick an exterior camera. So let's do locations, and we'll do exterior south, and we'll do, okay, so this is a good one. We'll leverage this camera. If I go to playback, you'll see that on this camera, this one actually might not be a good one. This one might have a little bit of motion on it. Let me do, I also need to turn on, let me turn on an overlay so you can see specifically what this is doing. Advanced Video Diagnostic Overlays, level 2. What this overlay is going to give me is it's going to tell me the frame rate. So, okay, let me pick a different camera. We're going to do blank views here and come down to my camera selections. And let's do this front intercom. See if I have it set on this one. I think I need to motion off the palm bushes there, whatever they are. What about this one? Okay, I think this one's getting us what we want. Yep. So what you can see here in the top left corner in my overlay, it says frames per second, 2 frames per second. But when I get to some motion in my video, and let's go to a block where we have some larger motion. How about right here? When I have motion in my scene, I have 10 frames per second. Okay. Or depending, on how that camera is set, I could have 15 frames per second or 30 frames per second, whatever it might be. What is happening here is this keyframe value. So continuous motion with keyframes, what that means is I am going to continuously record the keyframe from my video stream. And when there's motion, I'm going to keep all the rest of the frames as well. So the modern codecs, the modern high efficiency codecs, have keyframes and p-frames. The keyframes is every pixel in the image. The p-frames, or the progressive or filler frames that are in between, are only the areas of the image that are changing. So when we're looking at recorded video and we're getting nice, pretty recorded video, we are getting all the frames. And we're getting that at the rate of keyframe, p-frame, pre-frame, and so on. And it happens really fast. That's where we get the 10, 15, 20, 30, whatever frames per second. There is a setting on the cameras that determines how the ratio between the keyframes and the p-frames. On an Axis camera, you can do this from within the management client. On other cameras, you might need to do this inside the camera's web interface. So here we have 30 frames per second. Okay. We also have 30 frames per second, our nice full resolution, and we have right here max frames between keyframes. So if I'm running at 30 frames per second and I have 30 frames between keyframes, if these match, this is going to give me the equivalent of 1 frame per second. Now, we were looking at this other camera. It was this guy here. Now, this particular camera is a Hanwha. It does not give me the option inside a Milestone to specify my max frames between keyframes. For that, I have to log into the web interface to do that. Okay. So we'll leverage Axis for this because we can see the numbers. So my frames per second is 30 frames per second. Let's actually use our front door sidewalk here. I like this camera for this better. 30 frames per second with max frames between keyframes is 30. Now on the record tab, there is a checkbox. Record keyframes only. When we want to implement a continuous keyframes with motion, we want to check this box. Because what we're telling Milestone is, hey, Milestone, by default, only record the keyframe. This 5 frames per second value that we see here only applies to JPEG, so don't worry about that. All right. Now let's go back to the rule. So we need 2 rules for this. And then we need that checkbox. So there's 3 components to what this does. So we need a rule that says continuous recording. All right, what are we going to continuously record? We are going to continuously record. So perform an action in a time interval always. Start recording immediately on this group that we called continuous keyframe with motion. And to refresh everyone's memory, that is this group that I created here under System Groups, Recording Methods, Continuous Keyframe with Motion. So this group, anything within this group is getting this rule applied to it. And we record continuously only, well, okay. We're telling this group to record continuously. It's not any different from our normal continuous recording rule, with the exception of what we're telling it to record. And there's benefit to having these devices all in their own group, because then when I'm looking at those devices in that group, I have one checkbox that I can come and select. I can save that and it will apply that to everything in the group. If there's a couple cameras here that don't have that, well, I can come through and find those, check those camera at a time, or I can select the whole group and I can check that box for everything. So that's why I structure that to a group. It's also nice to be able to reference and say, hey, what group am I doing this on? What cameras are being recorded with continuous keyframe with motion? All right, so we have that. And we need that box checked, record keyframes only. Now that does sound concerning because we want the rest of our video. Well, that's where the second rule comes into play. So record continuous keyframe motion. So what we're doing is we're telling perform an action on motion started. This is Milestone's motion detection version of it. There's a hardware version as well if you're doing your motion detection on the camera itself. But we're leveraging Milestone's motion detection. So perform an action on motion started from continuous keyframe with motion. That's that same group that we were looking at. Set recording frame rate to all frames on the device on which the event occurred. This line is this setting. So here's keyframes only. Here's all frames. Well, by default, we want keyframes only, and then we want the rule to toggle between that one setting. And I'll finish explaining how the rest of this works, and then I'll tell you why this method versus another method that's common. So, oops, I pressed a key, which jumped me. So let's go back to our rules. Okay, record continuous keyframe motion, perform an action on motion started from continuous keyframe with motion, set recording frame rate to all frames on the device on which the event occurred. What's our stop action? So when motion stopped from this same group, the continuous keyframe with motion group, restore default recording frame rate of keyframes. So we're going to go back to just keyframes. So here we have record continuously, and based on our devices, the default is to only record keyframes. And then when we have motion, we're saying ignore the keyframes only and record all the frames. And when doing that, we get this. So we have 1 frame per second. You can see how the Jeep passing through the background here is stuttered. It's choppy. That's because in my motion settings, I have I have the street masked off because I don't want the street necessarily, triggering recordings all day and all night long. But when we have then a person walking through, now we have our 30 frames per second of that person walking through the scene. Once that motion disappears, you'll see that our 30 frames per second is going to go back. We'll get to the end of the motion here. It's going to go back to my 1 frame per second. There it goes. What this does is we get the benefit of having continuously recorded video with the space savings of only recording motion, because the amount of data, we're keeping less data than the continuous recording because we're not keeping all of the frames, but we are keeping, we still have those filler frames those keyframes in the middle between the motions to do that. Now, why is this important? This has become important in a couple different situations that seem to be becoming more prevalent. And I'll use an example here to illustrate. Let's say you have a visitor to your property, and that visitor, as they're coming into your property, trips and falls and hurts themselves. And they come to you and they sue you because they think it's negligence on your part. Well, if you don't have recorded video of that, then it's your word against their word. And the court's probably going to side on, is going to err on the side of the victim in that situation. If you have a camera where there is no video, like right here, I have the red is motion, the lighter red or the pinkish color is recorded video. So I have recorded video of this segment, okay? But in this gray area, there's no video. So that's not proof that nothing happened. We can't prove a negative by saying, oh, I don't have any video, so it didn't happen, because there's a million reasons why you might not have video. If it's out in a parking lot and it's out at distance, maybe there just wasn't enough motion to trigger the recording. So when we start leveraging continuous keyframe with motion, we are making it easier for ourselves to say, no, that didn't happen. I have video from that time frame that you're claiming to have been on my property and that you tripped and fell and hurt yourself. And guess what? You're not there. So therefore, I can prove that it didn't happen. That's the scenario why we're seeing this become more common. So continuous keyframe with motion gives you the benefit of having continuous video at a minimum of, whatever that max frames between keyframes is, which in my case is 1 second. By the way, side note on that, on an Axis camera, the default setting tends to be about 1 second. On a Hanwha camera, the default setting there tends to be 2 frames per second. But again, you can customize those. So I get the benefit of having video that fills in the gaps between my motion, that doesn't take up as much storage space, but I still get the nice, pretty video for the rest of it. Now, to kind of put this into comparison, adding that keyframe filler between our motion events can have anywhere between probably it depends on the amount of motion you have in the first place, I guess, but on average, it's probably a 20% bump in storage requirements. And that's just a rough ballpark. Again, that's going to vary depending on your current, there's nothing happening to motion. If I have a 10% motion environment, that's going to give me 90% keyframe environment. That'll be a different impact than I'm already anticipating a 60% motion environment where I only have a 40% keyframe. So some things to consider there. But this is a really great idea because it's going to fill in some of those gaps and some of those holes, particularly on exterior cameras. All right. That is recording methodologies. Now there is, let's see, from the list of what else I want to do or go over, I think we want to talk about, we can talk about motion settings or adaptive streaming. And by the way, if anybody has questions, we are coming up on the end of our session. We've got about 15 minutes left. So if you've got any questions that you want answers to, now would be a great time to hit me up with those, and we can kind of leave that open-ended. Or we can talk about adaptive streaming, or we can talk about motion settings. Unless somebody chimes in, I think we're going to talk about adaptive streaming. All right, we're going to roll with that. So adaptive streaming. To showcase adaptive streaming, I'm going to first show a new layout. And we're going to go to live. We need our overlay. And I'm going to use this camera down here in the bottom center. This camera is a high resolution camera. Its native resolution is 5,120 pixels by 2,560 pixels. It is a multi-sensor image stitched together. Gives us a 180 degrees from left to right and 90 degrees top to bottom. So I can pretty much see horizon to straight down with this camera, and then all the way left to right along the back side of the building. When I try to shove this full resolution into a layout that there's no way in this tiny little box on my screen that I'm going to get 5,120 pixels across, they just don't fit. What that's doing is it's increasing my computer's compute requirements. It's having to do extra work. And I can illustrate that here. So let's pull up Task Manager. And we're going to come to performance on my Task Manager. Let me make sure that this is set to always on top really quick. Settings and always on top. There we go. Okay. And I'm going to shrink it down so we can just see the graphs. All right, so what we're looking at is CPU and the GPU. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off adaptive streaming. I already have it set up. I'll show you how we set it up, but I want to show you the reasoning why. So adaptive streaming disabled, close. What I have right now is what you are typically going to see on most sites. Every camera is coming in at full frame rate, full resolution, and that is what it is, right? As you look at this, and I don't know how well this will show on through the Teams meeting, but the lines, are a little jagged. Look at the red couch here. That's not a nice smooth line. It's kind of a pixelated image. You can see it here on the table really well. You can see it here on the intercom camera where that column has a very jagged pixelated edge. Okay, that's because my computer's trying really hard to take the full resolution of this camera, and it's trying to shove it into this tiny little box, which is not anywhere near the resolution of this camera. So you're aware, the monitor that we're looking at this on is a 4K monitor. And so the pixel count of this box is probably something closer to 1280 by 720 as opposed to 2592 by 1944. And my CPU is running about 33%, 34%. It's hovering in there in, 30s to 35, we'll call it that. And my GPU is running about 50%. Now I have a pretty powerful GPU in this laptop. This is not common. So in most other laptops or workstations, you might see a higher impact here where maybe you're maxing out your GPU. And once your GPU is maxed out, you're going to start impacting your CPU, and that's going to start to climb and rise. So we'll say around 30% on the CPU and around 50% on the GPU. Now I'm going to turn, so we're going to go back to settings. I'm going to turn adaptive streaming back on, advanced, adaptive streaming, set that to enabled, and close. And we're going to see my frame rates change, my resolution changes, and my GPU that was running at 50% is now running closer to 30%. And my CPU that was running about 35% is now running closer to 18%. So adaptive streaming is going to let us it's going to lower the compute requirement on the computer. Oh, and here's another benefit. Look at my Ethernet connection. So where we were running about 50% on a 1 gig link, or at least whatever, the graph is scaling to. Now we're significantly lower. So we're about, 5 to 10 megabits per second. We were probably closer to around, maybe 100 before. All right, let me get that out of the way. Now we're going to talk about what this is actually doing. So using this top left camera of the front intercom, you can see that it is currently showing 640 by 480. So instead of showing the nice full pretty resolution, we're showing a scaled back resolution. We can also, if we want, do a different frame rate. So right now, I would guess that this is probably set to 15 frames per second because we're kind of hovering right around there. If I take this camera and I take it full screen, we're going to change now to a higher resolution, and we're going to go, I believe this one's set to the 30 frames per second, so it's going to start to climb up to the 30 frames per second. Okay, so we're changing the resolution as we change the scale or the size of the camera and how that's displayed. If I click a box and drag to zoom in on an area, right now we're again at that 640 by 480. If I click and drag that box and zoom in, it's going to change to that higher resolution so that we keep a nice image. If I zoom back out, it's going to scale back down. Okay, we can see that here again on, and to point out, recall how those lines before were really jagged. Now we have a smoother image. It's less pixelated. You can see that here as well. So in a lot of cases, if you're like looking at 4K cameras on a 1080 screen, they look terrible. So when you apply adaptive streaming, then you actually you get better performance on your workstation. The frame rates are going to be higher. The video is going to look better. The whole thing is going to be smoother across the board. So it's definitely a recommended setting to turn on. Now, how do we turn on that setting? It's two parts, two things. One, there is the Smart Client setting. So that is done here on Advanced. There is a setting for adaptive streaming. It has to be enabled. And you saw that when we disabled it, then we were getting only the full frame, or only the full resolution. Here's the other half of it. And by the way, that setting you can apply in a Smart Client profile. So we can go to Smart Client Profile, Demo Users, and under the Advanced, here is Adaptive Streaming. It's set to Enabled. And if I want to force it across everybody using that profile, that role, I can hit the locked button and they won't be able to turn it off or change it. Okay, so we need that setting. We also need some settings on our cameras, and let's look at what those are. And just to point out really quick, because I think this is going to clarify a little bit as well. If you haven't figured it out already, you'll be able to guess. Playback is not affected by adaptive streaming. Playback is always going to be whatever we recorded the video at. So on the examples we were looking at for this camera, it's 5120 by 2560. That's what my recorded video is. Okay. It's only in live where we get that benefit of the adaptive streaming. Okay, now how do we set that? On the camera. We'll use this rear panorama because it's a great example, just being a high resolution camera. We have our 5120 by 2560. Okay, well, let's go to the settings. So here is my stream 1 with my 5120 by 2560 at 30 frames per second. My stream 2 is still 30 frames per second, but I lower the resolution down to 1920 by 960. Or whatever you want to set that to. Okay. As I go down to my third stream, so here's video stream 3, I'm doing 1280 by 640. So to do this, you need to set up multiple streams on the cameras. And then you need to define, so we need the stream settings, and then we need to define those streams. So I do a video stream 1, video stream 2, video stream 3. I'm going to name it full resolution, mid resolution, low resolution. Okay, when do I need these streams? our options are always, never, or when needed. Okay. You're typically going to just do when needed for all of your stream settings here. When do I need video stream 1? Well, it's what's being recorded, so it's my primary recording. It's also my default playback. So just simply being recording, that's going to force it to always being needed. I could say always. That did used to be the method back in older versions of Milestone. Somewhere within, I think, the last year, they changed it to where the default is now when needed. But it is always needed because it's being recorded. Okay, what about my secondary stream, which is a slightly lower resolution? Well, I only need that one when it's being viewed by somebody. So I don't need to be pulling that camera through Milestone all the time. So we want to leave that as when needed. Third stream, same thing. Now, not every camera is going to support multiple streams. So there is some camera dependency on here. On an Axis camera, we can do up to 8 streams. If we look at a Hanwha camera, this Hanwha camera, there are some differences between models, but this Hanwha camera will give me 3 streams. I don't have any, but a lot of the older Samsung, Sony, Bosch cameras, they might only, or not Bosch, but Hikvision, Dahoo, they might only support 1 stream. So there is a camera dependency. The camera has to be able to provide the stream that you're requesting. And sometimes that can be a little bit of a game trying to figure out, okay, if my stream 1 is at full resolution, what does the camera support as a stream 2? So it's not always cut and dry. With Access cameras, you can pretty much pick and choose whatever you want, and the camera is typically able to provide that. One thing to be aware of, this is not a 4:3, this is not a 16:9 aspect ratio camera. This is a 4:3. So it would make sense that then on any of my lower stream resolutions, I would also pick the 4:3 version of that. What I like to do a 1280 and I like to do a 640. Those are the two that I target. And then I tend to do nice full, 30 frames per second or whatever my standard default is on my stream 1. On my stream 2 and subsequent streams, I tend to do half of that. So to review, what we need for adaptive streaming, we need the smart client setting set to enabled. We need the cameras to have multiple stream settings applied and those stream settings be compatible with what the camera can actually do. And on the streams, we have to define the additional streams and say when needed. And that's it. Now, if you have a large collection of cameras, this is a camera at a time setting. So there's 2 ways to work around that. One, there are third-party tools that will aid in applying bulk settings to cameras. Boring Toolbox is one that we leverage for that, and you can use Boring Toolbox to say, I want stream 1 to be max resolution and 30 frames per second, and I want stream 2 to be this resolution, and you can do that based on camera models or groups or whatever you want to do. If you want to do it all within Milestone, that's where this system groups and models comes into play. It's trying to load all the camera views because I selected the system groups, so give it a minute while it does that. But then once that expands out, I can select the individual camera models. And I built these groups using a script to group the cameras into these device groups that are named after the models. Come on, management client. Here it comes. So grouping them in that way is beneficial. It can be a little time consuming to manually do it, or you can use some Milestone scripts to do that. We can help you with those if you want, or you can, there's a Milestone PowerShell tools repository online that you can look at that's got some sample scripts and some ideas on how to handle that. But so for all of my, for example, P3255s, I have 5 of them. Instead of applying this each individually to one camera, I can do it to the whole selection in bulk, which is nice because now I can say, okay, for all my P3255s, for my stream 1, I want 1920 by 1080. For my stream 2, I want 1280 by 720. And my stream 3, I want 640 by 360. I set the frame rates for them, come over to the streams tab, add the 3 streams, give them a name, hit save, and I'm done. And so you can go through your models pretty quick that way. So, okay, that is everything that I had to cover. We've come to the end of our time. I hope this has been beneficial to you. If you are at a Stone office, you can, while you're there, if you need further information or details, go find one of our support engineers, track them down, and make them spill the beans on the rest of it. If you are joining us remotely, or later, if you're watching this on YouTube, reach out to us at stonesecurity.net. You can call our support line, and we're happy to help and provide assistance, if we need to look through these again. This will be posted to YouTube probably here in about a week or 2. And then you can use that as a reference to look back and see exactly what we're looking at, or that, that one little thing that you missed, you'll be able to find it there. So thanks for joining us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.